"Do not tell me you have never met your own wife," the stranger said with a puzzled smile. And for one impossible second, I wondered if the expensive suit on my shoulders had blinded me more than success ever had. People imagine that wealth buys certainty. It does not. Sometimes it only builds a larger stage for the moment your entire world quietly falls apart. Grant Whitmore had spent the last decade believing he understood every important piece of his life. He understood markets. He understood negotiations. He understood how to read investors before they spoke a single word. And above everything else, he believed he understood his wife. Vivian was 7 months pregnant. Gentle, elegant, quiet. She preferred homemade breakfasts over glamorous brunches, bookstores over designer boutiques, and evenings on the back patio instead of crowded charity galas. At least that was the story Grant had repeated to himself for years. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, one of his largest international clients insisted on meeting inside an invitation-only Michelin-starred restaurant overlooking Central Park. Grant arrived 15 minutes early, expecting another routine discussion about acquisitions and long-term investments. The hostess welcomed him by name before leading him through a dining room glowing beneath crystal chandeliers. Soft piano music floated through the air while city lights shimmered across towering windows. Every table seated people who carried influence without raising their voices. Grant barely noticed any of them until his eyes stopped on a familiar face across the room. Vivian. She was sitting at a private table surrounded by men and women in tailored business attire. Leather portfolios rested neatly before them. Tablets displayed financial reports. Nobody was eating. Nobody seemed interested in the menu. Grant instinctively reached for his phone, wondering if perhaps she had forgotten to tell him about meeting old friends. Then the restaurant manager appeared. He walked briskly toward Vivian, with 2 assistants following close behind. Every server along his path immediately straightened their posture. Nearby conversations softened almost at once. The manager smiled warmly before speaking words that seemed to steal every sound from the room. "Welcome back, boss. The executive team is ready whenever you are." Grant remained completely still. "Boss." The word echoed louder than the piano. Vivian answered with the same calm smile she wore every morning while pouring coffee at home. "Thank you, Michael. Please give us 5 more minutes." "Of course, boss." He nodded respectfully before stepping away. Nobody laughed. Nobody reacted as though anything unusual had happened. The executives simply waited for Vivian to continue speaking. Grant searched every face around the table. Several looked vaguely familiar from financial magazines and business conferences. One woman had recently appeared on the cover of a hospitality journal. Another man had been interviewed on national television after closing a billion-dollar resort transaction. Why were they all waiting for his wife? Grant forgot the client he had come to meet. He forgot the presentation saved inside his briefcase. Every logical explanation disappeared as another executive quietly slid a thick folder across the polished table toward Vivian. She opened it without hesitation, reviewed several pages, circled one paragraph with a silver pen, and handed it back. Every person around her immediately began making notes. Nobody questioned her decision. Nobody offered an alternative. It looked less like a meeting and more like the final approval of something extremely important. Grant felt an unfamiliar sensation tightening inside his chest. It was not jealousy. It was confusion powerful enough to challenge everything he believed he knew. For 5 years, he had shared a home with the woman sitting across that restaurant. He knew her favorite coffee. He knew which songs made her smile during long drives. He knew exactly how she rested one hand beneath her growing baby bump whenever she laughed. Yet standing only a few yards away, he realized there was one question he had never truly asked. Who was Vivian Carter before she became his wife? Grant never walked over to Vivian's table. Every instinct told him to demand an explanation, but years in high-stakes negotiations had taught him one valuable lesson. The first person who reacts emotionally is usually the first person to lose perspective. Instead, he quietly accepted the hostess's offer to wait a few more minutes while his clients finished arriving. She guided him to another private table with a clear view across the dining room. Grant barely noticed the leather-bound menu resting in front of him. His attention never left Vivian. The meeting unfolding across the room looked nothing like a casual lunch. A tall woman in a charcoal business suit placed another folder beside Vivian before speaking softly. Everyone else remained silent until Vivian finished reading the documents. She asked 3 short questions. The executives answered immediately. She nodded once, signed the final page, and slid the folder back across the table. Within seconds, several people began updating information on their tablets. The atmosphere felt remarkably familiar. Grant had witnessed that exact rhythm hundreds of times inside corporate boardrooms. It was the quiet confidence of people who trusted the judgment of the person leading the meeting. His phone vibrated. His clients had been delayed by traffic and would arrive in approximately 20 minutes. Normally, the unexpected delay would have frustrated him. Today, it felt almost deliberate, as though fate itself had refused to let him leave before uncovering whatever was happening across the room. He ordered nothing except black coffee. As the server walked away, another unexpected moment unfolded. The executive chef emerged from the kitchen wearing his white jacket and greeted Vivian personally. They exchanged a brief conversation before he smiled warmly and returned toward the kitchen. No menus had been opened. No orders had been placed. Whatever meal was coming had already been prepared exactly the way she preferred. Grant quietly replayed the past 5 years inside his mind. Vivian had never enjoyed expensive restaurants. Whenever they celebrated anniversaries, she usually suggested small neighborhood cafes or quiet family-owned bakeries instead of fashionable locations where reservations were difficult to obtain. Grant had always assumed she simply disliked luxury. Now he wondered whether she had been avoiding places where too many people might recognize her. Across the room, another man approached Vivian's table carrying architectural renderings instead of financial reports. He carefully spread several large drawings across the polished wood surface. Hotel layouts, resort renovations, restaurant concepts. Vivian leaned forward with genuine interest, tracing one hallway with her finger before making a small note in the margin. The group listened carefully before adjusting several measurements on the digital display. Grant recognized the collaborative energy immediately. This was not a symbolic meeting held for appearances. Every recommendation influenced real decisions. Every person there expected Vivian's approval before moving forward. A familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. "Grant, sorry we kept you waiting." His clients had finally arrived. He stood automatically, shook hands, exchanged polite greetings, and sat back down. One of them noticed where Grant's attention kept drifting. "Do you know the woman over there?" the older investor asked casually. Grant hesitated before answering. "She is my wife." The man looked genuinely surprised. "Your wife?" He glanced toward Vivian once more before smiling with quiet admiration. "Then you are connected to one of the most respected people in the hospitality industry, and you did not even tell us." Grant forced a polite smile, but inside his thoughts became even louder. Most respected? He had spent years discussing mergers, acquisitions, market trends, and leadership around the dinner table with Vivian, believing she simply enjoyed listening to his experiences. Now an uncomfortable possibility settled into his mind. Perhaps she had never been listening because she was curious about his world. Perhaps she had been quietly comparing it with one she understood far better than he ever imagined. Grant smiled through the remainder of the lunch meeting, but he could not remember a single number discussed around the table. Market forecasts, acquisition strategies, and projected returns blurred into meaningless background noise. His attention remained fixed on one image across the room. Vivian never once raised her voice. She never demanded attention. Yet every executive naturally paused whenever she spoke. It was the kind of authority no title alone could create. When both meetings finally ended, Grant deliberately delayed leaving the restaurant. He watched from a respectful distance as several executives gathered their portfolios before standing to thank Vivian individually. There were no exaggerated compliments or dramatic gestures. Instead, they spoke with genuine appreciation, as though finishing a conversation with someone whose judgment had guided them for years. One older gentleman shook her hand before saying quietly, "The Chicago renovation will move forward exactly as you recommended, Ms. Carter." Another executive added, "The board will appreciate your revisions before tomorrow's review." Grant noticed something else. Nobody addressed her as Mrs. Whitmore. Nobody referred to her as someone's wife. In this room, she existed entirely on her own accomplishments. Vivian thanked everyone with the same warmth she showed neighbors, grocery clerks, and waitstaff. Nothing about her demeanor changed. She was still the woman who laughed whenever their golden retriever chased butterflies across the backyard. She was still the woman who insisted on baking blueberry muffins every Sunday morning. Yet somehow she was also someone whose opinions shaped multi-million-dollar decisions. As the executives departed, Vivian remained seated alone for a moment, gazing quietly through the rain-speckled windows toward Central Park. Grant almost walked over then. Instead, his phone rang. It was his chief operating officer reminding him about an afternoon strategy session. By the time he ended the call, Vivian had already left. The drive back to Whitmore Equity Partners felt unusually quiet. Grant replayed hundreds of ordinary memories that suddenly seemed far less ordinary. Vivian always knew which hotel chains quietly outperformed quarterly expectations before financial publications reported the numbers. She often suggested charming boutique properties whenever they traveled, and those locations somehow became award-winning destinations months later. When Grant discussed staffing challenges inside his own company, she occasionally offered thoughtful observations that solved problems surprisingly quickly. He had always assumed she possessed exceptional intuition. Now he wondered whether experience had been speaking instead. Late that afternoon, curiosity finally overcame hesitation. Grant asked his executive assistant to locate publicly available information on every hospitality company connected to the executives he had seen inside the restaurant. Within an hour, she returned with a neatly organized report. Most names belonged to separate organizations operating across hotels, restaurants, luxury resorts, and commercial real estate. At first glance, none appeared directly connected. Yet one pattern quietly emerged. Several companies shared the same legal advisory firm. Others listed identical private trustees. A few had invested together in restoration projects for historic hotels throughout the country. It looked less like coincidence and more like an invisible network carefully designed to avoid unnecessary attention. One company name appeared repeatedly: Carter Heritage Holdings. Grant frowned. The surname struck him immediately. Carter, Vivian's maiden name. He opened another file expecting to find biographies of the company's executives. There were almost none. Press releases highlighted community projects rather than leadership. Charity reports listed anonymous donors. Business articles praised the organization's unusually stable culture while identifying only spokespersons instead of owners. It was as though someone had intentionally built an empire without allowing any single individual to become its public face. Grant leaned back slowly inside his office chair. For years, he had proudly believed he married a woman who preferred living far away from the spotlight. Perhaps that part had always been true. But now another possibility quietly formed in his mind. Maybe Vivian had never avoided attention because she lacked influence. Maybe she avoided it because she possessed far more influence than anyone was ever supposed to notice. Grant arrived home later than usual, but for the first time in years, he did not walk through the front door thinking about stock prices or tomorrow's meetings. Every question inside his mind pointed toward the woman already waiting in the kitchen. Vivian stood beside the stove stirring a pot of homemade soup while soft jazz drifted quietly through the house. She looked exactly as she always did. Comfortable cream sweater, loose maternity pants, bare feet resting on warm hardwood floors. A small smile appeared the moment she saw him. "Long day?" she asked gently. Grant nodded before setting his briefcase near the hallway table. "Longer than I expected." She walked over and kissed his cheek with the same quiet affection she had shown since the beginning of their marriage. Nothing about her seemed different, yet everything felt different to him. During dinner, she asked about his clients, his presentation, and whether the rain had made traffic worse downtown. Grant answered automatically while studying every expression on her face. He suddenly noticed details that had once seemed ordinary. Whenever she discussed business news, she never guessed. She spoke carefully, choosing words with surprising precision. Whenever she disagreed with an economic trend, she always explained her reasoning instead of repeating headlines. Years ago, he admired her intelligence. Tonight, he began wondering how often she had quietly withheld the full extent of her knowledge. After dinner, Vivian carried 2 mugs of herbal tea onto the back patio overlooking their peaceful garden. Autumn leaves drifted across the lawn beneath soft landscape lighting. It had always been her favorite place to unwind. Grant joined her, hoping the calm atmosphere might somehow make his questions easier to ask. Instead, silence settled comfortably between them. Finally, he spoke. "Can I ask you something unusual?" Vivian smiled. "You already have." He laughed softly before growing serious again. Who taught you so much about hospitality? She looked toward the trees before answering. My father. Grant waited. She continued slowly. He believed people never remember the thread count of the sheets or the price of the dinner. They remember how someone made them feel the moment they walked through the door. Grant recognized those words immediately. They sounded less like theory and more like a philosophy repeated many times throughout someone's life. Was he in the hotel business? He asked. Vivian nodded. Most of his life. She lifted her teacup but never looked away from the garden. He used to tell me that real leadership begins the day nobody notices you are leading. Grant felt another piece quietly fall into place. That sentence explained far more than she probably intended. Before he could ask another question, Vivian stood and disappeared briefly inside the house. When she returned, she carried an old wooden box polished smooth by time. She placed it gently on the patio table between them. Inside rested faded photographs, handwritten journals, yellowed newspaper clippings, and a simple brass room key attached to a leather tag marked Room 12. Grant carefully lifted the oldest photograph. It showed a modest roadside inn somewhere along the California coast. Beside the entrance stood a teenage Vivian smiling beside an older man wearing a work apron instead of an expensive suit. They looked proud, tired, and completely genuine. On the back of the photograph, someone had written 6 words in blue ink. Character should always arrive before success. Grant looked up quietly. Your father wrote this? Vivian smiled with unmistakable warmth. Every important lesson I have ever learned began with him. Grant slowly turned another page inside the journal. The handwriting changed from personal reflections to detailed notes about guest experiences, employee appreciation, renovation plans, and community partnerships. It was not simply a diary. It was the blueprint for an entire philosophy of leadership. As the evening breeze gently turned another page by itself, Grant realized he was no longer searching for hidden wealth. He was beginning to uncover something far more valuable. A family legacy built so quietly that even the people closest to it could spend years without ever recognizing its extraordinary reach. 3 days later, Grant believed he had uncovered every important secret. He was wrong. The final surprise arrived inside an ordinary envelope delivered by his legal department just before lunch. At first glance, it looked like another routine transaction summary. Instead, it contained the agenda for a confidential strategic partnership scheduled for review the following week. Whitmore Equity Partners appeared on the cover page as the prospective investment partner. Grant scanned the executive summary with professional confidence until his eyes reached the final approval section. He stopped reading. Beneath several committee recommendations appeared a single line that quietly changed everything once again. Final authorization subject to approval by the chairwoman of Carter Heritage Holdings, Vivian Carter. Grant slowly lowered the document onto his desk. His own company had unknowingly entered discussions with the organization his wife quietly led. Even more remarkable, she had never mentioned a single word about it. Not because she lacked opportunities. They had shared breakfast every morning, dinner almost every evening, and countless conversations about work throughout their marriage. Yet she had never hinted that both organizations were approaching one another through independent teams. The realization unsettled him for only a moment before another thought replaced it. She had carefully protected the integrity of both companies by refusing to blur the line between family and professional responsibility. That evening, Grant returned home carrying no briefcase. Instead, he carried the confidential agenda folded neatly inside a simple envelope. Vivian was sitting on the back porch wrapped in a light blanket, reading one of her father's old journals while gently resting a hand across her growing baby bump. The setting sun painted soft shades of gold across the garden. She looked up and smiled as he approached. You came home early, she said warmly. Grant nodded before taking the empty chair beside her. For several quiet moments, neither of them spoke. Birds settled into the trees while a gentle breeze moved across the lawn. Finally, Grant placed the envelope on the small wooden table between them. Vivian glanced at it once and immediately recognized the company seal. She looked back at him without surprise. So you know now, she said softly. Grant exhaled slowly. Our companies are negotiating with each other. Vivian nodded. Yes. And the final decision comes to you. It does. Grant expected to feel betrayed. Instead, what surprised him most was the complete absence of resentment. He understood exactly why she had remained silent. If she had discussed the transaction at home, every future decision could have been questioned. Every recommendation might have appeared influenced by marriage instead of professional judgment. She had chosen the more difficult path because it protected everyone involved. Grant looked toward the fading sunlight before asking the question that mattered most. "Did you ever consider stepping away from the review because of me?" Vivian smiled gently. "I considered it. Then the independent directors reminded me that fairness is not achieved by avoiding responsibility. Fairness comes from handling responsibility with complete transparency." She reached into the journal resting on her lap and carefully removed a folded letter written in her father's unmistakable handwriting. She handed it to Grant without saying another word. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear. The first sentence immediately captured his attention. "If one day the people you love discover who you truly are, never hope they admire your success first. Hope they recognize your character." Grant read the words twice before looking up. Vivian's eyes reflected quiet peace rather than triumph. She had never wanted to impress him with titles, influence, or wealth. She had simply wanted to be known for the person she chose to become every single day. As the evening light slowly disappeared beyond the trees, Grant realized the upcoming board meeting would decide far more than a business partnership. It would reveal whether he had finally learned to see his wife with the same respect the rest of the world had quietly given her all along. The morning of the board meeting arrived beneath clear autumn skies, but Grant felt none of the confidence that usually accompanied important negotiations. For years, he had entered executive conference rooms believing preparation was the greatest advantage a leader could possess. Today, he understood that humility might matter even more. Carter Heritage Holdings occupied the top floors of an elegant Manhattan building overlooking the Hudson River. The lobby reflected the same quiet philosophy Grant had discovered inside Vivian's family journals. There were no oversized portraits celebrating executives. No walls covered with awards or personal achievements. Instead, framed photographs honored longtime employees, restored historic hotels, community volunteers, and generations of hospitality professionals who had helped build the organization. Even before reaching the elevator, Grant sensed that this company measured success differently. An assistant welcomed him warmly and escorted him toward the executive conference floor. Along the hallway, employees greeted one another by name regardless of position. Senior executives stopped to thank receptionists. Maintenance staff received the same respect as department heads. Every interaction echoed the principles Vivian's father had written decades earlier. Character should always arrive before success. As Grant entered the conference room, several independent directors were already reviewing reports placed neatly before each chair. Financial analysts organized presentation materials, while legal advisors quietly discussed compliance documents. The atmosphere was calm rather than intimidating. One seat remained empty at the head of the polished walnut table. Grant recognized immediately who it belonged to. Conversations gradually softened as the conference room doors opened. Vivian entered wearing an elegant cream maternity suit that reflected quiet confidence instead of luxury. She carried only a leather portfolio and a notebook. No entourage followed her. She paused near the entrance to greet several employees individually, asking one about his recovering father and congratulating another on her recent promotion. Only after acknowledging everyone did she walk toward the head of the table. Every director rose naturally to welcome her before taking their seats again. There was nothing theatrical about the gesture. It reflected genuine respect earned over many years. The meeting began precisely on schedule. After reviewing financial performance, restoration projects, employee retention programs, and community investments, the agenda reached its final topic: the proposed strategic partnership with Whitmore Equity Partners. The independent committee summarized months of analysis before recommending approval under carefully defined conditions designed to protect both organizations. Vivian listened without interruption, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that encouraged further discussion rather than steering it toward a predetermined conclusion. Grant watched carefully. She never attempted to dominate the room. Instead, she created space for every voice to be heard before offering her own perspective. When the committee invited Grant to present his vision, he stood and addressed the board with unusual honesty. He spoke about long-term stewardship instead of rapid expansion. He emphasized employee development alongside financial growth. Several ideas mirrored the values he had learned from Vivian's family journals, not because he wished to impress anyone, but because they had genuinely changed the way he viewed leadership. As he finished speaking, the room remained thoughtfully quiet for several moments. Then Vivian smiled with quiet pride before addressing the board. "Every partnership should strengthen people before it strengthens balance sheets," she said calmly. "If we remain faithful to that principle, success usually follows on its own." The directors nodded in agreement before requesting a brief recess to finalize their recommendation. As everyone stepped away from the table, Grant remained seated, watching sunlight reflect across the conference room windows. Only a week earlier, he had believed he understood influence through titles, valuations, and negotiated agreements. Now he realized the strongest leaders rarely needed to remind others of their authority. They simply lived in a way that inspired trust. And for the first time since their marriage began, Grant no longer admired Vivian because of the remarkable organization she quietly led. He admired her because every extraordinary achievement had grown from an ordinary commitment to kindness, integrity, and unwavering respect for every person whose path crossed her own. When the board members returned to the conference room, the atmosphere remained calm, yet everyone understood they were about to decide something that would influence thousands of employees across two respected organizations. Grant looked toward the floor-to-ceiling windows where the afternoon sunlight reflected across the Hudson River. Only a few days earlier, he would have measured success by the outcome of this meeting alone. Now he found himself hoping for something much simpler. He hoped every decision honored the values Vivian's family had spent generations protecting. The independent chair of the governance committee resumed the meeting by thanking both leadership teams for maintaining complete transparency throughout the review process. He explained that every recommendation had been evaluated by outside advisors, legal counsel, financial analysts, and employee representatives before reaching the board. No shortcuts had been taken. No special treatment had been requested. Grant quietly appreciated those words because they confirmed what he already knew. Vivian had never allowed their marriage to influence the process. The final recommendation appeared on the presentation screen. The proposed partnership would move forward while preserving the independence of both companies, protecting existing employees, maintaining local community investments, and expanding leadership development programs across every property. It was not simply a financial agreement. It was a commitment to shared principles. One by one, the directors cast their votes electronically. Grant watched the display without speaking. When the final result appeared, every independent director had approved the recommendation. Gentle applause filled the room, not as a celebration of profit, but as recognition that two organizations had chosen cooperation without sacrificing their identities. Vivian thanked every committee member before standing. "Success becomes meaningful only when everyone connected to it has reason to feel proud," she said calmly. "That includes our employees, our guests, our partners, and the communities that have trusted us for many years." Nobody rushed toward the exit after the meeting ended. Directors remained to congratulate one another. Department leaders discussed implementation plans. Several longtime executives approached Grant personally, welcoming him as a trusted partner rather than a victorious negotiator. He realized something remarkable. Not one person spoke about winning. Every conversation centered on responsibility. As the room gradually emptied, Grant remained near the conference table while Vivian carefully organized her notes. He walked toward her with a quiet smile that carried none of the uncertainty from the restaurant days earlier. "I owe you an apology," he said softly. Vivian looked up with gentle curiosity. "For what?" Grant exhaled slowly before answering. "For believing I already knew everything worth knowing about you." Vivian smiled, but there was no triumph in her expression. "You never underestimated my heart," she replied. "You simply had not discovered every chapter of my story yet." Grant nodded thoughtfully. "I spent years admiring your kindness without asking where it came from. I admired your patience without wondering what had shaped it. I admired your wisdom without asking who first taught it to you." Vivian reached across the table and gently took his hand. "Now you know," she said quietly. Together they left the conference room and walked through the headquarters one final time before heading home. Employees smiled as they passed. Some greeted Vivian by name. Others simply wished her well before the baby's arrival. She answered every greeting with the same warmth, whether speaking to executives, receptionists, or custodial staff. Grant noticed that nothing about her behavior changed depending on who stood in front of her. That consistency explained more than every financial report he had studied. Outside, the cool afternoon air carried the first signs of autumn. Grant opened the passenger door of the car before helping Vivian inside with quiet care. As he closed the door, he caught his own reflection in the glass. The successful businessman looking back appeared familiar, yet somehow different. His company had gained an extraordinary partnership that day, but the greater reward could never appear on any balance sheet. He had finally learned that the strongest foundations are not built from wealth, influence, or recognition. They are built from character quietly practiced every single day, even when nobody is watching. 6 months later, the first warm days of spring brought new life to more than the gardens surrounding the old California Inn. They also marked the beginning of a new chapter for Grant and Vivian, one built not on unexpected discoveries, but on quiet understanding. Their daughter had arrived healthy several weeks earlier, filling their home with the gentle rhythm of midnight feedings, tiny laughter, and moments that somehow made every business achievement feel wonderfully small. Grant often found himself standing beside the nursery window before leaving for work, watching Vivian softly rock their little girl while morning sunlight filled the room. Every time he saw them together, he remembered the afternoon inside the Manhattan restaurant when he believed he had discovered the greatest surprise of his marriage. Looking back now, he realized that the greatest surprise had never been Vivian's influence. It had been how gracefully she had carried extraordinary responsibility without allowing it to change the way she treated the people around her. One Saturday morning, they traveled together to the beautifully restored roadside and where her family's story had begun decades earlier. The building looked different now, carefully renovated while preserving every meaningful detail of its original character. Fresh flowers lined the entrance. Families enjoyed breakfast on the outdoor patio. Children played beneath tall oak trees while longtime employees welcomed returning guests with genuine smiles. Rather than unveiling a statue or celebrating financial milestones, the day's gathering honored generations of staff members who had helped preserve the inn through changing times. Grant noticed that many employees had worked there for 20 or even 30 years. They spoke about Vivian's father with affection instead of formality, remembering birthdays, handwritten thank you notes, and simple acts of kindness that had never appeared in company reports. Inside the lobby, one framed photograph immediately captured Grant's attention. It showed Vivian as a teenager standing beside her father outside the same front entrance holding a worn toolbox after helping repaint guest rooms during summer vacation. Beneath the photograph rested a small brass plaque engraved with only one sentence: "Character outlives success." Grant smiled quietly. Those words no longer sounded like an inspiring slogan. They described the family he had married into. During the afternoon ceremony, local business owners, employees, community leaders, and guests gathered beneath bright blue skies to celebrate another completed restoration project. When invited to speak, Vivian thanked the architects, housekeepers, maintenance teams, reception staff, chefs, landscapers, and volunteers before mentioning herself only once, simply to express gratitude for continuing her family's tradition of serving others. Her speech lasted only a few minutes, yet every person listening applauded with genuine admiration. Later, as the celebration slowly came to an end, Grant carried their daughter through the gardens while Vivian walked beside him. The little girl wrapped her tiny fingers around his hand, and for a long moment nobody spoke. They simply enjoyed the peaceful afternoon together. Finally, Grant looked toward Vivian with a smile that reflected complete certainty rather than surprise. "I used to think leadership meant convincing people to follow you," he said quietly. "Now I think it means living in a way that makes trust feel natural." Vivian gently squeezed his hand. "That was my father's favorite lesson," she replied. As the sun began setting behind the hills, Grant turned one final time to admire the restored inn, the smiling employees, and the families creating new memories inside the place where one remarkable legacy had quietly begun. He understood at last that real wealth had never been hidden inside investment portfolios, luxury offices, or exclusive restaurants. It had always lived inside ordinary moments shared with extraordinary people whose greatest strength was never their success, but the kindness, humility, and unwavering character they carried long before anyone ever noticed their names. And from that day forward, whenever someone asked Grant Whitmore about the smartest decision he had ever made, he never mentioned a merger, an acquisition, or a profitable investment. He simply smiled, looked toward his wife and daughter, and knew that the greatest return on any investment had always been learning to truly see the people he loved.